All right, so last night we had some pretty major Democratic primary elections that were taking place, and in these elections, progressives absolutely curb stomped corporate Democrats at basically every single turn, even with the massive institutional and fundraising advantage that these corporate Democrats had. So Ryan Grimm here from The Intercept did a great breakdown on some of the most important notable races from last night. So I wanted to read to you some of the details and then give you my thoughts on how this plays into the broader momentum of the Democratic Party right now. So here Ryan Grimm says Democratic voters deliver stinging rebuke to party's Mansion Cinema wing. Voters shrugged off an obscene amount of spending from super PACs to send a message to Democrats, do something. And he says a Republican-backed super PAC on Tuesday fell short in its bid to intervene in a Democratic primary against Pennsylvania State Representative Summer Lee, a 34-year-old black woman and a rising star in the party who fended off a tsunami of outside money to best anti-union attorney Steve Irwin. So I think it's kind of funny she's running against a guy named Steve Irwin. Whatever. I wasn't, aware of that until today, honestly. But, rest in peace to the GOAT Steve Irwin, and sincerely rest in piss to this cheap knockoff here. But he continues saying the spending from a GOP-backed super PAC linked to AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which has been dumping money, millions and millions of dollars. We saw this in Nina Turner's race, especially dumping money into these races in order to try to defeat anybody who dares to criticize the state of Israel and their ongoing apartheid and genocide of the Palestinian people. But they continue saying left Irwin behind by less than 1,000 votes, and this was pretty close in the end. I mean, if you go and look at the final results here, Summer Lee has declared victory, but the margin here is very, very close. I mean, you could see literally just a couple hundred votes, but it wasn't that close from the beginning. The initial polling data from weeks and weeks and weeks ago, before this super PAC money started flooding into this election, had Summer Lee overwhelmingly beating Steve Irwin, which is the same exact situation that we saw with Nina Turner. She was overwhelmingly ahead of Shontel Brown. Then the dark money started flooding in, and she slowly but surely chipped away at that lead. It just so happens that in this specific instance, Summer Lee managed to prevail in the end. So you love to see it, but this is still going to be a David and Goliath situation, regardless of which candidate we're talking about here. They're always going to have to claw back from a disadvantaged position with all of this dark money that's flooding into these elections. But they continue saying a super PAC funded by the pharmaceutical industry blew more than $1 million in an effort to salvage the career of former Blue Dog Coalition chair Kurt Schrader, the Oregon Democrat, who cast the deciding vote against drug pricing reform in the House Energy and Commerce Committee and organized with Representative Josh Gottenheimer, an absolute corporate ghoul, to derail President Joe Biden's Build Back Better agenda. And his opponent, Jamie McLeod Skinner, lambasted him repeatedly as the Joe Manchin of the House. Clearly, that type of framing is effective, as we've just seen demonstrated from multiple different elections. People are rejecting the Kirsten Sinemas, the Joe Manchins of the party, and overwhelmingly favor people who are not going to block overwhelmingly popular policies, believe it or not. But they continue saying because Oregon votes by mail and some of the ballots were blurred and unreadable in areas favorable to Schrader, results may not be known until early next week. But despite a funding disparity of some 10-1, and the incumbent is on the ropes. So again, you see the massive disadvantage that progressives are put in these positions, but still, nonetheless, a very close election there. And they continue here with John Fetterman's election, saying back in Pennsylvania, Representative Connor Lamb, another corporate ghoul, despite having won the endorsement of nearly every Democratic high official and county organization in the state, was beaten handedly by Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman in the Senate primary, despite Fetterman having a stroke on Friday, which is something I didn't get to cover on this channel. But yeah, he did have a stroke, ended up in the hospital. Thankfully, he's doing fine. I think he also had a pacemaker implanted, as they say down here. So, thankfully, he's in good health now. But even with all of that context, still managed to overwhelmingly swamp Connor Lamb, who was, running those disingenuous attack ads that I covered on this channel. And, again, had that super PAC dark money that was flooding in to support him. And, as he was saying there, if you go and look at the list of the endorsements, I mean, it's absolutely insane. So this is the list of endorsements for Connor Lamb. Okay, basically, every single state representative and corporate Democrat within Pennsylvania was coming out to endorse him, and yet it didn't matter because somebody like John Fetterman, who only had these minor endorsements relative to Connor Lamb, still managed to overwhelmingly defeat him in this election. So clearly, just throwing those names around there and relying on the backing of the establishment of the Democratic Party, that's not going to be enough. enough anymore, but they say Lamb had the backing of the real Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, which his opponents used against him to paint him as a Democrat who would buck the party's agenda in the Senate. Another demonstration of how unpopular Joe Manchin's style of politics and corruption is with the broader American public. But they continue saying another super PAC in Oregon, funded by a cryptocurrency fortune and organized around the project of pandemic prevention, Protect Our Fortune, spent $10 million to boost Carrick Flynn, while the super PAC, Protect Our Future, spent $10 million to boost Carrick Flynn, while the super PAC linked to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the House Majority PAC, also dropped $1 million into the race. It backfired in local Democrats as well as national progressives, including the Congressional Progressive Caucus PAC and the Working Families Party, rallied behind State Representative Andrea Salinas, who appears poised for a victory. And he puts it in context here, saying the stunning wins come as the party debates who is to blame for Biden's sinking approval rating and increasingly dire forecasts of upcoming midterm losses. And party establishment figures have pointed the finger at the left for making unreasonable demands couched in slogans like defund the police that turn off voters. Okay, again, as if any members of Congress outside of maybe Cori Bush have been openly using phrases like defund the police. And I don't even think Cori Bush necessarily uses that phrase that much, but still disingenuously trying to attack the left as it is the most right-wing members of the Democratic Party who are tanking Joe Biden's supposed moderate agenda. So again, who exactly is the, who exactly is at fault in these, legislative battles that we've been seeing? But they continue saying the progressive wing has countered that. Biden's popularity has sunk as centrist Democrats have slowly murdered his agenda while the left has fought to enact it. So again, the entire progressive caucus, right? They were perfectly in line with Joe Biden's agenda. So how are you going to say that they were asking for too much when they were literally just fighting for what Joe Biden himself was asking for, and then that got torn to shreds by corporate members of the Democratic Party? It's a completely ridiculous narrative at face value. But they continue saying Tuesday's results suggest that Democratic voters, at least those in Pennsylvania and Oregon, would prefer the Democrats do more rather than less, surprise, surprise, delivering a stinging rebuke to Kyrsten Sinema Manchin wing of the party. And next week, voters in Texas will cast ballots in a number of runoffs that pit progressives against super PAC-backed centrist Democrats. And one of those key races is Henry Cuellar versus Jessica Cisneros. So be on the watch out for that. It's going to be really important. And of course, you got the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, their big money super PACs, once again, flooding in to protect an anti-choice Democrat as we have the overhanging threat of Roe v. Wade being overturned right now. That's where Democrats are choosing to try to protect their incumbents against pro-choice progressive challengers like Jessica Cisneros. So we're going to have to keep updated on how that election turns out, but a little bit more context here from Representative Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, said that the influx of money from Republican donors into Democratic primaries, even if the spending was unsuccessful in most of the races, represented a threat that Democrats needed to grapple with. And Senator Bernie Sanders recently argued that Democrats need to bar super PAC spending from Democratic primaries. And Jayapal told The Intercept that she supports such a move. And the rest of the wins, she said, were a real blow dealt to big PAC money that thought that they could buy every race. So both of them are 100% correct in this instance. Of course, you shouldn't let, as the Democratic Party, while this isn't much of a surprise that they do allow this, of course you shouldn't be letting Republican donors and billionaires and super PACs jump into these primary contests where they're just overwhelmingly going to give a massive advantage to corporate Democrats over progressive challengers. So listen, I mean, if these PACs were not a part of the equation in any of these elections, they wouldn't have even been close. I mean, some of them weren't really close at the end of the day, like the John Fetterman one, but things like this, these would not be these close of margins for somebody who literally worked for like a union busting law firm, being this close to somebody who's representing a broad multiracial working class coalition like Summer Lee. They wouldn't be this close if it wasn't for that dark money. So of course, you should be banning that from banning those PACs from being involved in Democratic primaries, even if you want to make the argument that we need that money to go take on GOP challengers. Okay, whatever, I disagree, but even at a more fundamental level, of course they shouldn't be allowing Republicans to flood money into these races to support basically Republican Democrats in name only. But I saw a couple tweets online that I thought were good responses to the results of these elections and basically putting it in context. So here first from Nate Silver, love that name, but he says Connor Lamb was supposed to be such an electoral juggernaut, and he acted like it, proclaiming in a New York Times puff piece after 2020 that the squad's politics were unworkable and extremely unpopular. Well, you just lost to somebody who had basically the same political beliefs as members of the squad. There's obviously some differences there and, some shortcomings from a candidate like John Fetterman, but nonetheless, he is very much closer to the squad than to the corporate Democrat Connor Lamb's style of politics. And, it actually turns out that Connor Lamb's style of politics is the one that voters think is unworkable and extremely unpopular. Again, not that surprising when you're basically portraying yourself and receiving the endorsement of guys like Joe Manchin. Of course, voters are going to look at you and say, why the fuck would we want another Joe Manchin in the Democratic Party right now who's just going to block the moderate centrist President Joe Biden's agenda? I mean, it's completely delusional to think that that was going to be an effective strategy, but that's exactly what they thought was going to take place. But another tweet here from Sawyer Hackett. He said, Fetterman's victory should redefine the Beltway assumptions on electability. A burly, tattooed progressive who suffered a stroke on Friday just defeated a clean-cut veteran centrist two-term congressman. And he says, meanwhile, I wish Fetterman wouldn't cave to the racist Beltway thinking on issues like Title 42. Again, he has some shortcomings. Hard to call yourself a Democrat while trying to keep Stephen Miller policy in place. So, he does have some questionable opinions on things like Title 42, as well as his stance on Israel. And we'll get to that. We'll be covering that. But of course, you want to get John Fetterman elected and into office before you start to confront a lot of those flaws that he has. But, overwhelmingly, if you look at his policy agenda, he is more in line with somebody like Bernie Sanders than, really anybody else in the Senate. So Jeff Stein asked his campaign what his priorities are going to be for his policy agenda, and he responded with promote U.S. manufacturing, making more shit in America, obviously creating good, sustainable union jobs here in the country, and he is openly in favor of the Green New Deal. So, that's a fantastic priority. Prioritizes the PRO Act as well, the Protect the Right to Organize Act, that would significantly help unions to engage in union campaigns without having to suffer from illegal union busting activities from gigantic billion-dollar corporations. Also supports a minimum of $15 minimum wage and wants to go even further than that. Better trade deals, universal broadband, legal weed was something he was heavily leaning into. Voting rights, codifying Roe v. Wade at the federal level. He does want to get rid of the filibuster to do that, and ramping up U.S. energy. So, in a broad picture way, John Fetterman, obviously not perfect, but overwhelmingly better than the corporate Democrat Connor Lamb, who was trying to beat him in this election, and obviously overwhelmingly better than whoever his GOP opponent is going to be, which at this point, it seems like it's most likely it's a very close election that they're still counting the votes on right now, but it does seem like it's going to be him versus Dr. Oz. So, I wouldn't think in my head, at least I hope not. I know this is a fucked up country with a lot of insane people in it, but I would hope that would be somewhat of an easy election for John Fetterman to win against somebody who is just a massive Trump delusional idiot who, is feeding into a lot of the lines that Trump himself has been pushing and really doesn't stand for any policy agenda that would materially improve the lives of working class people. So, John Fetterman, I think, ran a fantastic campaign. He does have that broad working class appeal, obviously being somebody who's like 6'9" and giant and wears, average clothes instead of wearing a button-up suit and tie, clearly played to his advantage. And I think that he's somebody who does have a real future in the Democratic Party and does have a real future in U.S. politics. So I'm glad that he won. I'm glad that Summer Lee won, and I'm glad that all of the rest of these progressives are definitively proving that the Manchin and Sinema style of politics that is going on right now is not popular, and that, believe it or not, the American people overwhelmingly want people who are going to fight for a bold left-wing economic agenda.